LiterASIAN was first started in Vancouver in 2012 by Mr. Jim Wong Chu with a mission of celebrating Asian Canadian literature and storytellers. I first heard of LiterASIAN in 2015 when I was invited to Vancouver to speak at this event. And I remember asking Jim why he started this, and he said, if we don't celebrate authors within our own communities, then who will? So LiterASIAN Toronto is made possible with the support of the Canada Council for the Arts, the Department of Asian Canadian Studies at the University of Toronto, the Department of English at the University of Toronto, and the Cheung Yu Tung East Asian Library at the University of Toronto. The theme of this year's LiterASIAN Toronto is looking to the future, the evolving narrative of Asian Canadian fiction. Since the late 1700s, people of Asian origin have made important contributions to Canadian heritage and identity. Fiction written by Asian Canadian authors have evolved and diversified, ranging from the original immigrant story to achieving the Canadian dream to looking beyond into the future within science fiction and fantasy tales. Today we'll be discussing how the world has changed over time and how fiction represents these changes. Our event today consists of two panels. The first one involves a discussion on the history of Asian Canadians and the female Asian Canadian perspective of writing. The authors featured on the first panel are Arlene Chan, Carrianne Leung, and will be moderated by Lisa Marr. At the end of the panel, there will be a Q&A. The second panel involves a discussion on the modern writings of Asian Canadian science fiction and fantasy. The authors featured on the second panel are Derwin Mak and Thea Lim, and the moderator is Tanya Gulaway. After each panel, we will also have a reading by authors who have been published in Immersion. Immersion is an Asian speculative fiction book published jointly by the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop and Dark Helix Press. We are pleased to have Derwin Mak and Serah Lewis here to read an excerpt from the short story published in Immersion. At this point, I would like to invite Ms. Hannah Kim to say a few opening remarks. Hannah Kim is a director of the Cheung Yu Tung East Asian Library at the University of Toronto. And I have to say, this would not have been possible without her, and I thank her very much for her support. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Hannah Kim. I'm the director of the Cheung Yu Tung East Asian Library. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So on behalf of the East Asian Library, I'd like to welcome you to today's event. We're thrilled to host the LiterASIAN Toronto 2019, an extension of the LiterASIAN Festival in Vancouver, to celebrate and explore Asian Canadian writings past, present, and future in partnership with the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop and the University of Toronto's Asian Canadian Studies program at University College. In addition to LiterASIAN Toronto, this year we are also happy to celebrate the publication of Immersion, a book of 15 Asian speculative fiction stories from around the world and a collaborative project by the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop. So last year at our first LiterASIAN Toronto, we had some amazing pioneers and authors of Asian Canadian literature, Joy Kogawa, Shani Mutu, Lin Kuchikake, Chuck Kwan, and Kai Chung Tom. And some of them are here today. Thank you for joining us. This year we have another roster of outstanding guests, Arlene Chan, Carrianne Leung, Thea Lim, Derwin Mak, and Serah Lewis. The late Jim Wong Chu, founder of the LiterASIAN Festival, once mentioned that he believed that LiterASIAN will eventually evolve into a destination event with international appeal. And I think that LiterASIAN Toronto will also follow suit. This is a very meaningful event for our library because one of the East Asian Library's mandates is to preserve and make accessible interdisciplinary knowledge and history of Asian Canadian communities and the Asian diaspora. This festival strives to reflect Asian Canadian storytelling in all its diversity. I hope you all enjoy the event today. Thank you.
And I would like to introduce the moderator of our first panel on the history of Asian Canadians and female Asian Canadian perspectives on writing. Moderator Ms. Lisa Marr is a historian of Chinese in Canada and immigration in North America, the Richard Charles Lee Chair in Chinese Canadian Studies, and she's also directs Asian Canadian Studies at the University of Toronto. So without further ado, Lisa.
Thank you, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of our Asian Canadian Studies program, which offers a minor in Asian Canadian Studies and courses about Asian Canadian history, culture, and community, and also has a research network dedicated to inquiry about Asian Canadian Studies. So we're very proud and very happy to partner with the library and with ACWW for the second Toronto LiterASIAN. And I'd like to introduce our wonderful guests who have so graciously agreed to appear today. The first writer is Carrianne Leung, a fiction writer and educator. She currently teaches creative writing in the MFA program at the University of Guelph. She holds a PhD in sociology and equity studies from OISE, University of Toronto. And her first novel, The Wondrous Wu, which I've assigned in my Chinese Canadian Studies class, and students love this novel, was shortlisted for the 2014 Toronto Book Award. Her collection of linked short stories, That Time I Loved You, was published in 2018 and also received a nomination for the Toronto Book Award. In addition, received the Danuta Gleed Award for short fiction. And we're very, very honored to have Carrianne here to discuss her writing. And also, it's especially significant that both of our authors today are from Toronto and write about Toronto. And I think that brings something really special to your writing. So thank you so much. And our other writer on this panel is Arlene Chan, who was born, raised, and educated in Toronto. After obtaining an undergraduate degree in English and psychology at U of T, she graduated with a master's degree in library sciences. Her career as a librarian started at the North York Board of Education and ended at the Toronto Public Library, where she spent 30 years in progressively advanced positions. She has since had what might be termed a remarkably active retirement, an inspiration to us all. She has published 7 books about the history, culture, and traditions of the Chinese in Canada. And this has been during the past 20 years. When she's not researching, writing, and speaking to groups or leading tours, she can be found searching for the best food in Chinatown. She currently serves as the president of the Jean Lum Foundation, board member of the Little Pear Garden Dance Company, member of the Heritage Interpretation Working Group, and advisory member of the Toronto Public Library's Chinese Canadian Archive. She is also the recipient of the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Award, Heritage Toronto Special Achievement Award, and the Women of Achievement Award Tri-Delta Convention in Dallas, Texas. Thank you to both speakers, and we'll start with each of the authors doing a short reading from their work. After that, we'll do a little bit of moderator question and answer, and then open up to the audience for additional question and answer discussion. Thank you.
Do you want me to?
Oh,
I'll just go up here and read. Okay. Wasn't sure where I was supposed to go. Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here. I'm so honored to sit with Arlene on this panel. Such tremendous respect for the work she has done in the Chinese Canadian archive. It's so important what she has gathered. I also am so happy to be in an event where people don't have to ask me how to pronounce my last name, and they do it properly. That's such a tremendous joy and satisfaction. Okay, I'm going to read from That Time I Loved You, and I'll just read from the first story called Grass. It's a collection of 10 short stories. It takes place in Scarborough in 1979. 1979. This was the year the parents in my neighborhood began killing themselves. I was 11 years old and in grade 6. Elsewhere in the world, big things were happening. McDonald's introduced the Happy Meal, Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Iran, and Michael Jackson released his album Off the Wall. But none of that was as significant to me as the suicides. It started with Mr. Finley, Carolyn Finley's dad. It was a Saturday afternoon in freezing February. My best friend Josie and I were sitting on her bed playing Barry Manilow's Copacabana over and over again on her cassette player and writing down the lyrics. I was the recorder while Josie pressed play, rewind, and play again 100 times, repeating the lines over to me until the ribbon finally snapped and we had to repair it with Scotch tape. "Did you get that, June? Did you get that?" She kept asking as I nodded and wrote fiercely on lined paper. We kept all the transcribed lyrics in a special pink binder marked songs in my balloon lettering. I didn't like the song as much as she did and wanted to switch to La Freak to practice our new dance moves, but Josie was determined to unravel the mystery of Lola at the Copa. Josie's brother Tim came in the front door, slammed it hard and thumped up the stairs shouting, "Josie, June, Mr. Finley's dead. He's fucking dead." At first I thought Tim was just angry at Mr. Finley. We often were mad at him because he was our softball coach and mean. Then I realized by the sound of Tim's voice that he was serious. Mr. Finley was dead. Tim burst into Josie's room to tell us the grisly details. Mr. Finley had offed himself with one of the hunting rifles he kept in a display case in his basement beside his collection of taxidermied animal heads. His daughter, Carolyn, was in my class. The one time I had a sleepover at her house, we slept in the basement. Dead deer and owl and bear heads had cast eerie shadows on the walls. She'd snuggled into her Benji sleeping bag and drifted off while I was rigid as the snarling heads above me and didn't dare close my eyes. Josie and I had never been invited to a white family's house before, which is why I had said yes. And after I told Josie all about the horror show, we assumed all white people decorated their homes with dead animal parts. No, thank you very much. Mr. Finley was the first person in the neighborhood to kill himself. It gave me the chills. Not long after that, Georgie De Silva's mother on a warm June night shuffled out to their double garage and drank a jar of Javex bleach. At 8:30 a.m., Georgie went looking for her when he didn't see her in the kitchen. He found her body sprawled on the oil-stained floor, a stream of white sudsy liquid pouring from her nose and mouth, her eyes looking right at him. That's what all the other kids on the street said anyway. We all began to worry. This was my and most of my friends' first experience of death. It was kind of exciting at first, but then it got scary. Would there be another one and another after that? Thank you.
I'm going to sit down for this. So I'm going to read from the first book that I wrote, and it's actually, I couldn't have chosen a better subject because the subject of my book is about my mother, Jean Lum. So the title of this is The Spirit of the Dragon, the story of Jean Lum, a proud Chinese Canadian. So I'm just going to read a couple sections from there and start off with meeting the Prime Minister. "What did he say?" asked the Prime Minister of Canada as he leaned towards Jean. In 1957, over 20 Chinese Canadians chosen from across the country were in Ottawa to ask Prime Minister John Diefenbaker to change the immigration law that separated Chinese families. Earlier, there had been a tax called a head tax on Chinese coming to Canada. Then in 1923, the government introduced the Exclusion Act to stop more Chinese from coming to Canada. The law kept families apart, husbands in Canada, wives and children in China. Even when the government ended the Exclusion Act in 1947, families continued to be separated. Only Chinese who were Canadian citizens could bring their families over to Canada. If someone wanted to bring his mother, she had to be older than 65, and only children 18 years or younger could come. This was unfair and kept families apart, and Jean, who valued family life, knew how unjust it was. Jean was invited to join the group that was to meet with the Prime Minister. The group traveled to Ottawa from across Canada to try to persuade the Canadian government to change the law so that families could be together. "What did he say?" Prime Minister Diefenbaker asked again. He had asked Jean, the only woman delegate, to sit next to him during the presentation. The leader, Mr. Wong, was giving a speech to explain the reasons why the group thought the law should be changed. Jean knew his speech by heart because she had helped Mr. Wong, the official spokesperson, to practice it over and over again on the train ride to Ottawa. Each time the Prime Minister asked, she repeated what Mr. Wong had said. "You saved the day, Jean," exclaimed Mr. Wong after the meeting. "The change to the immigration laws was my greatest accomplishment," says Jean. She had carried out her father's dream to see Chinese families reunited. It was years later that Jean discovered that Prime Minister Diefenbaker had trouble hearing in one ear. Jean was sitting on the side of the Prime Minister's good ear and Mr. Wong on the side of his bad ear. From that day, Jean became known as the unofficial spokesperson for the Chinese community. Community work. In the late 1960s, Jean helped in a campaign to save Toronto's Chinatown. She was in charge of representatives from over 40 Chinese organizations who went to City Hall to save their Chinatown. Wealthy businessmen with their own ideas about improving the downtown area wanted to tear it down and build expensive high-rise apartments and offices. Jean and her group convinced the city politicians that Chinatown had to be saved. It was important to the Chinese community and to the people of the city. Led by the mayor of Toronto, David Crombie, the city limited the height of new buildings to 4 stories. Chinatown was saved. Toronto's Chinatown was not alone in its fight against being demolished. Jean went to Vancouver and Calgary as the only woman representative to help save their Chinatowns too. Another important event for Jean in the 1960s was meeting Pauline McGibbon, who later became the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, the Queen's official representative to the province. She encouraged Jean to extend her volunteer work outside the Chinese community and into the Canadian way of life. Taking Pauline McGibbon's advice, Jean worked as a volunteer in a number of organizations, including the Women's College Hospital, University Settlement House, and Mount Sinai Hospital. To do volunteer activity outside the Chinese community was a huge step to take for a Chinese Canadian, particularly a woman. It had been the custom for Chinese, like many other immigrant groups, to stay within their own community. For someone to work outside it was a remarkable achievement. But then Jean was a remarkable woman. Jean's work in the community was so important that she returned to Ottawa to become the first Chinese Canadian woman to receive Canada's highest honor given to its citizens, the Order of Canada. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you for reading your wonderful works. It's just a taste. I encourage you to further pursue reading these works. They are absolutely wonderful works. And the theme of this panel is the evolving Asian narrative and a discussion of the history of Asian Canadians and female Asian Canadian perspectives on writing. And it's very clear just hearing the settings and the content of the readings that personal and family experience are certainly an inspiration in both of your works. And our first question is if you could please talk a little bit about your family history or your own history in Canada, and then also how that influenced your calling as a writer, sort of what you choose to write about, because it's really interesting that you kind of can see that connection between your experience and what you've chosen to write about. Oh.
Can you hear me? Good. So I'm third generation Chinese Canadian on my mom's side. So my maternal grandfather came in 1899. And he was one of the fortunate few men who was able to bring his wife over a few years later. So when my grandfather came, he paid the $50 head tax. And by the time my grandmother came a few years later, the head tax was $100. My father came in 1921 from the province of Guangdong. And when he came, he paid the $500 head tax. So that's just a bit of background to my family and when they arrived in Canada. My mom was born in in British Columbia. She came to Toronto in the mid-1930s. This was during the Depression because she had to find work to help support the family. There were 12 in her family. So my mother went on to do amazing things, and I just gave you a taste of the kinds of community work that she did. And so my profession, as you heard in the introduction, was a librarian, and I was one of those kids when I was growing up. I've always loved reading. So I was one of those kids when the lights were out, I was under the blanket with my flashlight reading. But what I really noticed when I was growing up, when I went to the public library, I was always looking for something to read about Chinese people. And I think the only thing that I remember reading as a kid was The Five Chinese Brothers. So you can either regard that as something that was really racist in its stereotyping of what Chinese people were all about, although that book is listed as Teacher's Top 100 Books of the Year. So that's what I remember. And so even when I was going through high school, I was very interested in our history in not only Toronto, but in Canada, our Chinese-Canadian history. And when I went to the library again, very, very little written there, or what I could find there was very limited. So I sort of fell into writing very accidentally. A publisher who was Umbrella Press that published my first book, he had commissioned someone to write a children's book about my mother. And my mother, by this time, was very, very well known in the Chinese community. But all the writing that was out there was writings that were in magazine articles, newspaper articles, and no books. Again, very, very little in terms of what you could find about Chinese Canadians. And so this person that was commissioned, it wasn't working out too well. So the publisher said, "Oh, Mrs. Lum, I know you have a daughter. She's a librarian. Do you think she might be interested in writing this book?" And my mother's immediate reaction was, "Oh, no, 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 no. Arlene, she's working full-time at the library. She's got 2 young children. Her husband is never home because he works in the hospitality industry. She's much, much too busy." So when she told me, and I just sort of went, "What? Wait a minute. Here's a door opening." So I was put in touch with the publisher, and I said, "Why don't I write 1 chapter, and if you like it, I'll keep writing, and if you don't like it, then I'll totally understand." Well, he liked it, so I kept writing, and that's how I wrote my first books. So I kind of fell into writing accidentally. I mean, I've been writing short stories when I was in high school, but this was very, very special for me. And as much as my mother told me so many stories, I still had to interview her and get the dates and really pay attention to the details, because, you know, if you hear your mother's stories, your father's stories, you kind of say, "Yeah, I've heard this one so many times before." So this really made me buckle down and get the facts straight. So that was my first book. And then it was just, I'm not a good example as an author, because I have so many of my friends and people come to me and say, "Arlene, you've published so many books. I have a manuscript. How do I get published?" And I'm not a good example because I've never had to go and find a publisher. So after this book, I did another for Umbrella Press, and then another publisher asked me to write a book about a Chinese festival, and then that led to writing a book about dragon boating, which I became a total fanatic when I was doing my research on the Dragon Boat Festival. Again, nothing had been written in English about the Dragon Boat Festival. Nothing had been written about the Mid-Autumn Festival when I wrote about it. So all these opportunities came knocking at my door. So I just feel so blessed that I retired over 10 years ago from working at the Toronto Public Library, but I'm leading a very fulfilling life as writing. I'm trying to squeeze in my writing, and I'm doing a lot of presentations at schools and for groups about our history. And I get so much pleasure when people come up to me and say, "You know, I heard you speak. Okay, thanks. I tend to do that with technical things. But I just feel so blessed that I'm able to to talk to so many people, inspire people to learn about their own family history, inspire people to keep reading about our history. And I've had so many people say, I had one history major who was a teaching assistant at York University, and he said, you know what, I've been studying history for years, and I did not know anything about the history of the Chinese in Canada, so it was news to him. So I just feel so blessed that I can share these stories, tell stories, and really hopefully inspire people to read more and also inspire other people to write and learn more about our history.
So my family and I immigrated in the early 70s, and I was 6 years old when I came from Hong Kong. I learned English through reading. I was a really shy, scared kid who lived in the library. And you know, it's kind of a boring story. All writers say, I read everything in the library, and which is true. I just wanted so much to join the world of books. And yeah, I very much wanted to search for something that looked like me. And I found the brothers too, the Chinese brothers. That was the only book in my library that had anything in English that had Chinese people, and it was quite a racist. It's quite a racist book if you've seen it. So I always wanted to join the world of books, but because I never saw that reflection, it never seemed possible. It wasn't until I was in university in my 20s that I read my first Chinese-Canadian novel, which was Disappearing Moon Cafe by Sky Lee. And it really changed things. And then I read, you know, Evelyn Lau, Runaway, and the possibilities began to be more clear. Even then, I didn't actually have the confidence to do it. I did a lot of other things. Like then I went back to school and did a master's degree and a PhD and everything to avoid actually writing the novel. Until finally when I finished a PhD, I really missed an intellectual project, and I sat down and thought, I'm gonna do it now. And at that point, you know, I was in my 40s when I started The Wondrous Woo. So it's like, you know, this is the only thing I've ever wanted to do in my life, and I didn't actually end up doing it until I was in my 40s. And by that time for me, there were no stakes, just pure pleasure. And I loved writing it so much. And I feel like for me, growing up in the suburbs, there wasn't a lot of stories about racialized people in the suburbs. And I really want to reflect that and what that experience was. For me, like when I was a kid going down to Chinatown, and I write about that in The Wondrous Woo, it was a revelation to me because there were Chinese people, but they felt so culturally different from me. And they spoke Toisan, which I kind of understood and didn't understand. So it was a very strange experience to find identity, but always it was language. And I'm not so much interested in my writing about identity. That's not my concerns anymore. I feel very excited that there are so many of us and we write about anything and all the things. And also that I'm in a moment where I am finally writing and publishing, and there seems to be more space and more readers who are interested in all kinds of things that we bring.
Thank you. Thank you both for just so wonderfully sharing how you came to write what you're writing and the kind of path you took. It's personally very inspiring. Thanks. And just our next question gets at this sort of larger theme of the evolving Asian Canadian narrative. And this can be understood in many ways. For Arlene, you've mentioned that you know, going to the library and finding kind of a gap, an erasure of Chinese Canadians' experiences and filling that. And in your case also, in your younger days, you know, seeing a limited range of Chinese Canadian fiction available widely, and now, of course, a wider range. So just from your perspectives, if there is such a thing as the Asian Canadian narrative, or at least a cultural impression of what Asian Canadian stories are more broadly, what do you see it is, or in your observation and experience, how is it changing? I know you alluded to that very directly in talking about your writing and the kind of space there is for very for a much wider range of Asian Canadian writing to be received beyond sort of, I mean, in every genre rather than being seen as a more limited kind of appeal.
First, I want to also say, like, I resist and push against this idea of Asian Canadianness because I think the default is often Chinese, and then East Asian, and then Southeast Asian, and South Asians get left out of it. So I resist, first of all, in putting those blanket terms. In terms of a narrative, like when I first started reading novels and literature, and that was Chinese Canadian. It was Sky Lee's Disappearing Moon Cafe, Wei Sin Choi, Judy Fong Bates books that were very much based on that generation in Chinatown. And since then, we've moved to a lot of other kinds of diasporic senses of belonging and writing about issues. Like Thea's book is about immigration, but it's not the canonical immigrant story, right? So I think that in terms of like, it's just kind of blasted wide open, and that there is that kind of freedom for us then to explore many kinds of complexities. Like the book I'm writing now, the narrator's a raccoon, not even a Chinese raccoon, right? Like, so like, I think that that's the kind of joy in our ability to be able to liberate our imagination and to write from all kinds of things. And of course, even as I write from a raccoon, race is very much part of that, but not obliquely so maybe.
My kids always used to tease me that I was around when the dinosaurs were roaming the earth. So I'm going to talk about the change that I've seen in the Asian Canadian narrative, and I'm going to use World War II as the dividing point. So leading up to World War II, the narrative was that all Chinese people, there was this thing about the yellow peril, there was this thing about, all the Chinese were not suitable, not of British aspirations, as John A. Macdonald said, and he was very proud that he took away the vote from the Chinese people, that Chinese were not good enough to become full Canadian citizens. It was fine that they didn't have, we took away the right to vote. They were not good enough to serve in World War I and World War II. So this was what was being written in the media. It was being written in 2 royal commissions that targeted the Chinese and the Japanese immigrants. It was written in the laws. In British Columbia alone, there were over 100 anti-Chinese laws there. So, and written by mostly male writers, and I can only think of one female writer, was Emily Murphy, who did not have kind things to say either about the Chinese. So that was the narrative that was happening before World War II. And then the turning point was after World War II. We had the repeal of the Chinese exclusionary law. The Chinese got the right to vote. They could now become full citizens. Immigration laws were being eased to ease family reunification. And what was the narrative? And I remember when I was in the 50s, there was so much. The narrative then was Chinese, the Chinese, and I'm only going to speak about the Chinese Canadians because that's my background and my area, is that Chinese were the model minority. And there was so much pressure on all of us, and I've talked to many of my friends when they were growing up. We were expected to be so well behaved all the time, and if you misbehaved, you were, a real blemish on, we're bringing shame to the entire Chinese community. And you have to remember, when the war ended, there were only 2,000 Chinese in Toronto. Everybody knew everybody. And I remember one time, news got to my father. He said, someone told me that, he's talking to my mother, he says, I heard that you were walking around with this young Chinese man, so, what's going on? And that young Chinese man happened to be one of my older brothers. So it's just, it was a very small community, and everybody knew everybody, and when you met somebody new, they would say, who's your father, what's his name, and what village is he from in China? So that's how small the community was. And now as we're in closer to this time, we're getting that narrative of it's the Asian invasion. So it started with the Asian invasion moving to Scarborough in the 70s and 80s, and then we have the Asian invasion of students that are coming here to study, the invasion in our Canadian universities that is still being written about. versus this whole thing about crazy rich Asians, that all the Asians are, have lots of money, and now you look and you see media ads and you see Asian faces because it's supposed to be the Chinese are now considered a real consumer group that needs to be focused on. So, and yet at the same time, there's still this thing about there's still a lot of discrimination. So there's that narrative that, there's still a lot of racism going on. So again, you've touched on it, that the Chinese community now, we have over 500,000 Chinese Canadians living in the Greater Toronto area. So a huge difference from when there were 2,000 Chinese living just before Second World War ended to now over 500,000 in the GTA. Such a diverse group, because up until Second World War, most of the Chinese that were living in Canada, living in Toronto, were from the province of Guangdong, from one of the Taisan or Sunway, or some of the 4 counties and the 5 counties. But now the Chinese community is so diverse. They're coming not only from different parts of China, from Taiwan, from around the world, Singapore, and speaking different languages. Of course, Mandarin, which is the official language, but there's Cantonese, there's Taishanese, there's Hakka. Such a diverse group. And then we have first generation, second generation, third generation, and real newcomers. So such a diversity, and so many. Like, what is the narrative now? Like, you can't sort of say this is what it is. There are so many influences happening, so it's a very complex world out there. And I think that's what's going to bring us so much richness in our writing. And like Carrianne's story, so many stories to tell, and it's just the tip of the iceberg of all the different experiences that are going to be told.
Thank you. I can see the kind of the landscape of just how narratives have developed about Chinese Canadians and others has changed tremendously, and is a kind of ever-evolving set of stories, much like the rest of the narratives in our culture, ever-changing and certainly interesting. And so our next topic looks particularly at publishing, and I hope that here you may be able to give a sense of your experience of how the publishing landscape has changed over the course of your writing, and perhaps include some advice to some of the students out there who are kind of maybe thinking about the impossible dream of writing while also focusing on the practical concerns of a job that will pay for university or, make a living, or how. So I realize that's a bit beyond the pre-circulated question of how has the publishing landscape changed over the course of your writing. But if you do have within that discussion any wisdom from your experience for students in the audience, I think they would very much appreciate it. I've had many a student in my office say, I love writing, but how can I make a living? I can't do this. It'll disappoint
How
my
do you
parents."
make a living? I don't know.
So,
I can't answer that. But before I get to that question, I want to point out how important what Arlene said was in terms of the ways in which Canadian policy has shaped our experience as Chinese Canadians, because I came in 1972, right after the immigration policy turned into a point system, which is why so many of us from other parts of the world were able to come here. Before that, it was geographically based in preferred Western Europe, right? And also because I think in 70-something, 72, 73, Canadian Multiculturalism Act became a national policy. And that also shaped the discourse of the time in terms of how we talk about identity and race and belonging. So those are things that, because I'm also a sociologist, I need to also insert how important those constructs shape our narratives and our experiences. Okay, publishing. I don't know how you can make a living and have all your dreams come true. I'm still trying to figure that out. So when I first wrote The Wondrous Woo, it sat on slush piles for years. And I only applied to independent publishers, the indie presses, because you can't even get to the big presses without an agent. And I knew nothing. I wrote The Wondrous Woo, and I'm like, this is funny. I'm gonna just now get it published. And it sat and sat and sat. And finally, this tiny feminist press called Anana Publications picked it up and published it. And it was only because it got nominated for Toronto Book Awards that it got more attention, and agents started to call me and ask me if I had anything else. So then I wrote, That's How I Loved You. And I honestly, maybe one of the things, advice I can give is don't worry about the market. I hear so many writers worry about what the market wants, what publishers want. You just write your story, because I did not feel like what I wrote was commercially viable. I just wrote what I needed to write, and that will always be how I write, and be guided by what I feel I need to tell. But they liked it, and HarperCollins published it, and it did quite well. So I think go network, go to literary events, meet people. There's a really great grant that I always tell emerging writers to apply to. It's Ontario Arts Council. And I think it's still, what is it called? Remember, Thea, where you submit work, and it has to, all these independent presses have to read it. And the recommender grant, I think it's called, Ontario Arts Council. And this is a way that publishers will actually read your work, because they have to, and you may get some money for it. And then that way, you can also get to know what's out there and what they publish.
Thank you.
Yes, how do you make a living as a writer? I have so many people asking me this, and I always say that to them, keep your day job, because I do not write because I want to make money, but I'm fortunate that I'm not relying on writing as my source of income. So writing is something that you want to do because that's what you want to do. Carrianne, you said that was your passion, and you're writing now. Again, things have changed so much from when I started writing, and I sort of call it when digitization, like when we got the internet and when we didn't have the internet. And when I was in the days when my first books, there was no online databases, there wasn't even like Google searching and things like that. So, and everything was done by pen and paper. It didn't have word processing and all those things that now I don't know how I would live without. So things have really changed, but because of the internet, book publishing, as you know, book publishers are all having a lot of difficulty. A lot of bookstores are closing down because people are buying their books online through Amazon or Chapters Indigo, so bookstores are closing down. But the good thing about the whole internet thing is that you don't have to publish a book through a publisher. You can do independent publishing, you can self-publish, you can write blogs, you can start your own website and write there. So before, it used to be magazines, newspapers, and books were the only way that you could get published. But now there are so many other opportunities, and I really do encourage people to keep writing. And when people ask me, how do I find a publisher, I mean, they really want to find a publisher. I always direct them to, like Canadian directories of publishers. Depending what you want to write, there's all these publishers, indie publishers and more established. They have their niche, what they're looking for, so you should do that kind of research if you do want to find a publisher. But the bad news is that even for the publishers that I have, when I go to visit the offices, all the corridors are full of boxes of unread manuscripts. So it's very, very hard to find a publisher, and you're right, you need an agent if you want to go with the major publishing houses. But again, self-publishing is a way to go, and it's affordable, and it's doable, and again, on the internet too, so through blogs and websites.
Thank you. Really appreciate your perspectives. Our next question looks at one of the themes of the panel, female Asian Canadian perspectives on writing. And I'd like to ask the panelists to please discuss how have female Asian perspectives, either your own or as a writer, or maybe your observation, changed? What's been your experience as a woman writer in particular, or your larger sense of female perspectives on writing? It's a very open-ended theme, so you could take it whichever direction you want to.
So when you're a women writer, even when you write fiction, there's an assumption that you're writing about your life, and especially if you're a racialized women writer, that what you write is drawn from your life. And that makes me mad, because I also have an imagination, and I can write fiction, right? So there's issues like that around, like, it's not said explicitly, but I feel like there is this kind of like hierarchy of what is seen as maybe higher brow fiction and literary fiction, and where that belongs. And sometimes, you know, I don't know. Like, there's also, like, I feel like every book I write, I feel I need to be funny, because I think life's pretty sad and humor is really important. And I don't think, you know, there's also that notion of serious books should not be funny. I don't know. These are just things that I kind of feel, the feelers that I have out there around, you know, what gets taken as serious literature. I feel pretty good in the ways in which I have been received. Like, I feel I've been very respected as a writer. I know that I have 2 friends who are East Asian writers who have written memoirs, and lots of boundaries have been crossed, and they've had a very hard time in dealing with how invasive questions from the media have been, and questions from readers have been in their own private space. So I don't know if that's like answers your question, and I'm just venting here now, so.
Thank you.
I can just kind of think back to times when it was all male writers writing about female characters, and females were characterized as being either dragon ladies or China dolls, or so when I'm writing, I mean, because I'm writing nonfiction and I'm writing about history, I'm very aware of the lens, and trying to make sure that when I'm telling stories or representing stories, that I'm very cautious about how stories are being told. And I feel so lucky, because all the books that I've written, like when I wrote my 2 books about the history of the Chinese in Toronto, and I pretty well knew about everybody that I was writing about, again, because of my mother's community work and my parents having a restaurant in our first Chinatown, that I got to meet so many of these people that I was writing about. So it was having that sensitivity and trying to tell the story so that it wouldn't be misrepresented, and just remembering the horrible stereotypes. I mean, when I was a kid growing up in the 50s, we used to go to the Beaver Theater on Saturdays to go to matinees. So you not only got your full-length movie, but you got a news clip, and then there was also this cartoon, and then there was a serialized thing that, so every Saturday you'd see the next part of the story. And what was being played was featured Fu Manchu, and it was so, you know, the eyes, it was not an Asian person, and the eyes pulled back, and the Fu Manchu, and a very evil character. And so this is what I'm trying to avoid when I'm writing it. And it really, it's something that I can't get out of my mind, and I'm thinking of all the, you know, the characters that I watched on television, even like the Kung Fu series, TV series that was made starring David Carradine. They turned down Bruce Lee because they didn't think that audiences were ready for a Chinese person playing a Chinese person. And so this is what I grew up with, and so I have the lens on. I don't think it's the lens of a female writer, but just the lens of somebody who's had experience with, you know, stereotyping and racism in the past. So
Yeah, it's hard for me. Like, I'm not that old. Like, in terms of like my immigration history and my age, I'm not quite sure ever how to convey this to people who are younger than me. You know, like, and I didn't live your youth, and I can't imagine the kind of pain. I just know, even when I was growing up in the 70s, there was just such tremendous pain because of the racism and regular basis being told to go back to where you come from. Like, there were moments when I was with my parents, and people would say this to my parents, you know, and growing up as a child and seeing your parents being so disrespected. like I can't even really convey. I understand, like, you know, and I feel the racism now, and it's a different feeling, but that was like every day. And being like the only kid in a school of white people in Scarborough at that time. So it's from that point of view, the kind of ethics that I feel I need to bring into writing my characters come from that history also, of that pain, and honoring the generations that came before me. And you know, the first time I read about your mom, I was in tears at how a Chinese woman in Toronto was such a force, you know, because models were not easy to find. And when you don't see yourself reflected back at you, something happens to you. You know, the ways in which you are erased and diminished, even from yourself, is horrible. And that, to me, is what racism does, and why it's so important for me, even when I'm not writing specifically about race, how those ethical relationships among my characters have to be crafted so very carefully.
Thank you. I really appreciate your incredibly thoughtful comments. It just leaves a lot to think about. Our next question is one that really gets at how this panel, it can only be kind of a beginning in thinking about all of the issues and questions our authors have raised. Are there any stories left untold?
We're just beginning. There's just the world, I think, is totally opened up. And there's, again, there's so many forums for people to tell their stories. And I think it's because we've got, I mean, I remember talking to Tony Chan, Dr. Anthony Chan, who wrote Gold Mountain. And he said, he wrote Gold Mountain. He says, because why are not Chinese people telling their own stories? So when he wrote Gold Mountain, that was the first book about our Chinese Canadian history that was written by a Chinese person. So this is something, this was the beginning of something, and then we have Paul Yee, who started in the same year in the early 1980s, and now Paul Yee's written over 25, he's got 30 books. These are so important because, again, it opens up so much for everybody else, and to hear the stories, and again, because of the diversity of the Chinese Canadian community, there are stories that have yet to be told. But we have things like the Chinese Canadian Archive at the Toronto Public Library, and now there's one at the University of Toronto. That is giving us, again, the confidence that you have this material that never was available before. And now we're going to start building this real collection of all our stories, and then that will encourage more and more people to come out and tell their stories too. So I think we are just starting to tell all of our stories, and it's going to make an incredible resource for all of us. And again, when I used to do my research, I had to go, I mean, I was sitting at an index table, I pull out an index book, I look up, guess what the subject headings are, and then write down the names of the magazine articles, the newspaper articles, and then go to microfiche and microfilm and try to do all this research. Now we have access 24/7 to all these databases that you used to have to pay for. Even the Toronto Star used to have to pay if you wanted something searched in the Toronto Star. So we have all these resources. So these were things that are becoming more and more available now, but with these archives, with these museums that are starting up, that there's going to be one in Vancouver, and these incredible collections at the library here and next door at the Richard Charles Lee Library. These are so important because it gives us the material so that we can do our own research, learn more about our own families, and then just be building and adding more and more stories so that, again, I think it's just the tip of the iceberg.
The question was, is there any stories left?
Untold.
Untold. Oh my God, everything. Yeah, everything. Tell everything. It's infinite. We have so many stories, and I believe in literature so much that literature and culture can change the world. There's, especially now, we're in such crisis. Like, our world is in such crisis, and we need more of our imagination and more narratives that can show us other ways of being and being better selves, better humanity, our full humanity, so everything. And you know, what did Toni Morrison say, her famous line about, write the book you need to read, right? That's really powerful.
Thank you. At this stage, we will now switch to audience question and answer. Well, I guess if anyone has a question, is there a person? There's a person with a microphone, and you can go to her, or she will go to you if you wave. And please feel free to ask our authors anything.
Hello. Is this working? Yes. Hi. Thanks so much for this panel. My question is for Arlene. Arlene, you spoke about how at the time it was really different and pioneering in a sense for your mother to be volunteering outside of the Chinese community. Can you tell, you said you focus more on the Chinese Canadian community, but can you tell us a little bit about the relationships that she made with other like non-Chinese Asian people or racialized communities in the city? I know like there's a lot of solidarity from the Black community when I believe like Chinese launderers were having troubles in Chinatown. So any other relationships beyond the Chinese community, especially with non-Chinese Asians or racialized communities in Toronto?
Yeah, so you're talking about when she was working outside of the Chinese
Yes,
community.
you mentioned in the reading, and I'd love to know more about that.
Yeah, so again, her inspiration was Pauline McGibbon, who said that she should work outside the community now. And so if you can imagine my mother being born in Canada, and so she spoke really, her English was impeccable. And so for her to go outside the Chinese community and start talking about the Chinese community to a non-Chinese audience, that alone, it was almost like people were shocked. I mean, even when I was growing up, people would always say to me, you speak such good English. So here was my mother representing the Chinese community and speaking so eloquently about so many subjects that alone really, I mean, you can get rid of all the discriminatory laws that were in place, but the hardest thing to really change are people's opinions, people's perceptions. And so having my mother just speaking to different groups outside the Chinese community was a lot. And what she used was she used Chinese culture. So first of all was food. So my parents owned a restaurant in Chinatown, our first Chinatown, called the Kwang Chow Restaurant, which became a meeting place for a lot of politicians and newspaper people. And these were people who were shaping opinion in the city. So using food, and so she not only had people coming into the restaurant, she would go to the Royal Ontario Museum and do a cooking demonstration. She would be on radio talking about, you know, Chinese food and fortune cookies and things like that. And this, in the 50s and 60s, this was new information for people outside the Chinese community. And then the second thing she used was Chinese dance. So she formed a Chinese community dance group, and the dance group, and I was recruited, voluntold that I was part of the dance group. But we performed all across Canada, not for just Chinese groups, but also outside the community. So this was bridging the Chinese community with the larger community. And my mother always said, because when she was growing up, she had to go to a segregated school. And she walked past a school that was for everybody else except for Chinese, Japanese, and our indigenous people. And she felt from that early age, why am I being treated so differently? Why can't I be inside this circle with everybody else? So this was really something that had an impact on her, and that's why when she started going out and speaking outside of the Chinese community, it was a really important bridge. How do we bridge a smaller community with the larger community? So that's what she did. Well, were there any other communities that she connected with? She connected with a lot of other ethnic groups, and my mother received one award from the Filipino community, And I never understood why she got that award, and it was because she became a spokesperson helping the Philippine Canadians as well. It's the highest award that's given to Filipinos, and so my mother received that award. So she did liaise with many, many other groups, the Jewish community, the Black community, so it wasn't, and it was basically the Chinese community and everybody else. She was trying to form those bridges. Yeah. Don't be shy.
So this question is for Carrianne. So what are you working on next? Like, are you working on another book?
You can say I'm working on another book. It's kind of a stop and go. So, like I was saying, I'm working on this book that's narrated by a raccoon. So it's like an apocalyptic fairy tale. That's kind of how we're. I'm saying me and the raccoon are thinking about it that way. And it's really funny. I was just saying to my kid, when I write, the characters follow me around. Like, that's when I know something is happening. They're constantly with me, and I talk to them. And now this raccoon is with me all the time. And my kid is used to me being super flaky, so he's just like, oh my God, now we're living with a raccoon. Does the raccoon pay rent? Oh my God. And it's about the apocalypse and humanity, all narrated through the eyes of feral animals. So.
Hi, thanks so much for this panel. It's been so great. This is a question for both of you. How have you experienced or interacted or become involved with the literary community in Toronto? And how has that kind of informed your writing process, if at all? And how have you found being part of that community?
I feel this is the best thing for me about being a writer, is I get to have writer friends now, and I feel so inspired by contemporary writers in Canada, especially Black, Indigenous, and racialized writers. I feel there's such a moment right now. And so some of the things that I've been invited to readings, to events, going to events, and like Festival of Literary Diversity, Fold in Brampton is one of it feels like every year it happens, I feel like it's coming home because I have such strong relationships with writers there. And I also, there's a Facebook group that I started. So when I wrote The Wondrous Woo, I was thinking what do I do now? Because I heard I have to promote and stuff. And so I started a Facebook group called Diverse and Turtle Island Writers in Canada or something like that. And now we have I think 900 members. And what we do is we just share opportunities. So if there's literary journals are asking for submissions, or there's tips on writing, workshops, webinars. So doing that and just seeking, and writers are pretty friendly people, I have found, mostly, 98%. I haven't really been treated badly by anybody. So just talking to people, and it's such a joy to be in this moment as a writer.
I just share, the joy of meeting a lot of writers and getting to know other writers. As far as, I don't belong to any professional organizations like Writers Union or anything like that. I just feel like I have my writing space in my house, and sometimes I'm just kind of squirreled away in my little space. But I agree, we get to meet some amazing people and share stories of how we're writing, and sometimes, I remember I was with one group of writers, and this was early on when I was writing, and they said, Arlene, one person said to me, Arlene, I want to give you a good piece of advice. She said, when you do your researching is so much fun. It's just you can keep on going, and the hardest thing is to say, I've got to stop researching and start writing, because when you start writing, it's so so, I mean, it's so much more fun doing research, but when you have to do the writing, I don't know about you, but it can be really painful. And my husband feels the most pain of all because when I get into that writing mode, you're talking about you're getting into your raccoon persona. It's when you're getting into that writing space, you take on. I almost go into a different character. I don't know, and so anyhow, that's my story. Writing time.
Awesome, thank you. Hi, this is for both of you, but maybe Carrianne has a bit more to say about it because she kind of mentioned it earlier. It's kind of hard to word, but regarding like the tendency to view works of racialized authors as like commentary on race, that can come with some kind of conflicts as well. So like, how do you balance like being aware of the ethics that you bring to your characters, but maybe your work's not being specifically about race or about culture, or like the desire to add to the cultural representation, but not always writing about specifically culture and race?
Okay. I'm trying to understand the question so I can give you a good answer. How do you write about race without specifically writing about race?
Yes, I'm
Yeah.
also like, just because there is a tendency to view the work of any racialized author as commentary on race.
Yes.
How do you balance that perspective, like knowing that your works will be taken in
Yes.
that light, even when you're not
For
specifically
sure.
writing about race and
Okay,
culture?
yeah, thank you. Thanks for clarifying. You can't control how people are going to read your work. You don't, and I think about this a lot, when that question of who's your audience when you're writing. My audience is me first. I think that these are craft questions too, in terms of how you make decisions as a writer and how you write race. I have, now that I know how that people read what they need to read, that gives me tremendous relief as well, that I need to just be ethical for my own sake in terms of how I craft story and characters, but what people will read is going to be about what they bring to the reading, in lots of ways, I'll always be, it depends, also the ways in which I get introduced, even. This is a Chinese-Canadian writer, or this is a Canadian writer, or just this is a writer, Carrianne Leung. Like, even those framings are things that I don't necessarily control, and I try not to let that dictate what I create. What I create is very much grounded in my own experience of the work. I don't know if that makes any sense, but there really isn't. And I go to Goodreads. Goodreads? Is that the review? I go to Goodreads and I read reviews of my work, and it's astounding how the ways in which people will love your work and hate your work. And so it's then you realize that there's nothing you can do, really. Like, the text will do what the text does and satisfy what it does for yourself, but the ways in you get read, you don't have control over that. The life of the book lives by itself, separate from you. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Is that okay? Does it feel pressuring, though, knowing that people might, just because there's a smaller body of like Chinese Canadian authors or anything else, that people might take you as more of an example, and say like, and if it is viewed in a negative light, it's not just like on your book, that people might use it to also like negatively comment on like all Chinese Canadian authors. Like, does that feel pressuring?
No, I don't feel, because there are things that I can't control, like there really are things that, I've been told, with the Wondrous Woo, I went to a book club where a white reader said to me that I was being stereotypical and racist about Chinese people without getting the irony that I was trying to spin, right? So, am I always going to write these model minority characters that are going to be always good and one-dimensional? No, because I insist on our full complexity. And I insist on that for our characters, my characters that I write. So I don't feel the pressure to represent in any particular way, except that I try to be very ethical and mindful of the ways in which real bodies get treated in the real world, right? And that's all I can do.
Thank you.
This question is for Arlene Chan. You mentioned that your mother actually helped prevent the demolition of Chinatown. But I read somewhere that the first Chinatown was demolished to build the City Hall. Could you clarify that?
Okay, good question. Our first Chinatown, which was located where New City Hall is right now, what happened is our first Chinatown was in a part of the city that was known as the Ward, which was short form for St. John's Ward. And by the time the Chinese were the last major immigrant group to move into the ward. They were preceded by the Jews, and then before that, the black community, and before that, Irish and Scottish. So Chinatown had a very bad reputation because it was in a very, everything was really not doing too well. The buildings were really old and it had a very bad reputation. So in the 50s, land was expropriated with the purpose of building a new city hall. So New City Hall, construction started in the early 60s, and in 1965, New City Hall was completed. So 2/3 of our original Chinatown, the land was expropriated for building New City Hall. There was no community consultation at all, and most of the Chinese who had to move, they were not compensated fairly. They were not given fair market value for their properties, so they were totally ripped off. But the Chinese had no voice, and they just moved on. That's why we started our Chinatown at Spadina and Dundas. That was the beginning of it. So 1965 happened, and then there was discussion about the city politicians wanted to tear down what was left of our Chinatown. And not only that, they really wanted to get rid of the designation of Chinatown because they felt it was the name of a ghetto. And so that's when my mother organized the Save Chinatown Committee to fight, this time to fight back when they did not fight back the first time around. So that was when all the Chinese community organizations and businesses rallied to save what was left of Chinatown. And what happened at that time was, this was when we started getting reform politicians voted into City Hall. This is when Jane Jacobs started appearing on the scene, because the city was sort of, up until that point, tearing down the old and building the new. So this was a new movement of reform that we should really be preserving our historic buildings. So when the Save Chinatown Committee was went to City Hall to make their deputations, there was support not only by politicians, but also in the community that Chinatown should be saved. What was left of it should be saved as well. So that's the work that she did. And so it was David Crombie, because he wanted to put a moratorium, because everything was being torn down and these new high-rises, big, huge high-rises were going up. That was David Crombie who put a moratorium and put a height limit, so that really halted the further demolition of Chinatown and all these high-rises being built there. So you're right. When Chinatown, that's why there was kind of part one of Chinatown being demolished and part two of the plan to demolish what was left of Chinatown.
Thank you.
Can I have another question? Anybody else? Okay. This one is for Carrianne Leung. I know you said that the perception, it doesn't worry you of your writing. What is your reaction in your book when you have one story is the Portuguese mother who committed suicide? It's on the parents that kill themselves. But I mean, the first perception is that they say, Leung, what do you know about Portuguese?
What do I know about the Portuguese?
That's
absolutely.
That's what the perception will be for the readers, because it seems to be hardwired into us. Because when I read it, I said, Leung, no. So it was my reaction.
Yeah.
So, and then of course, I said, well, that's
that's not supposed to be react this way. But I'm sure that you get a lot of this kind of reaction.
No, I don't.
You don't?
I think people think it, but they don't actually say it to me. So thank you. First of all, thank you for reading my book. That always makes me happy when I know people.
I
like
read
the book.
both. I
Oh,
just
thank
finished
you.
The Wondrous Woo. I love Wondrous Woo.
Oh, thank you so much. That's so sweet. I think like we're having conversations now around cultural appropriation, right? And who can write what stories. And we never get very deep in these conversations. It's either just like, you can't do it, you can't write other voices. And it's usually like, white folks have been appropriating our stories for a long time and continue to do so. So, even when you think about Pearl Buck's, what is Pearl Buck's? Good Earth, right? Like that, those kinds of like histories where we're very capable of writing our own stories now. But the fact is, I grew up in a neighborhood where who I felt as my chosen family were Portuguese kids and black kids and all of us kids in this little neighborhood in Scarborough. And the intimacy and love that we shared with each other and the fights, made me feel like I could risk and write stories about that time and about those characters. And so that's how, but no one's ever said to me, and I found it interesting because I thought when I first published the book that was what I was going to get a lot of. Like, what do you think about writing from a point of view of a character that's not Chinese Canadian? Then I think, do I always have to be from that point of view? Like, now I'm going to write about a raccoon. Is anyone going to come and ask me what rights you have from writing from that perspective? How would you know, right? So those are things that I like to test and play with, but also, again, thinking about it from a very ethical point of view and ethical relationship. The other thing about, the question about how has Asian Canadian narrative also changed is I'm very concerned about relationship between racialized communities, right? In my PhD dissertation, one of the things that really guided me was, what if we weren't paraded out one by one and told as the Black Canadian story, the Chinese Canadian story? What if we were all present in the same place at the same time, which is real life, right? What happens and what gets disrupted about narratives then and about the official Canadian narrative? What if we're all here and all our stories are here? Then what? So I'm very interested in that even in our fiction, in my fiction. Yeah.
Yeah, because I got some really, I wrote, my book is about Chinese growing up in Calcutta. And I've got one audience from East Asia practically yelled at me, what do you know about Calcutta?
Right, and
Yeah,
there's
it's
such
so-
a large Chinese
Yeah,
community
yeah,
in
I
Calcutta.
really get yelled
Yeah.
at.
Right.
So that was kind of quite interesting.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to the complexity. Like we're really complex, and we can't be contained in these narratives that we have been reading about ourselves or writing about ourselves. That there is more, and I think that pushing and opening up those spaces to talk more, history has really positioned us together in these ways. So.
I'd like to thank the audience for your wonderful questions and to the panelists for their wonderful answers. And we're going to now move on to the next stage. Oh, right. Yes. Yeah, I was going to do this afterwards, but we also have thank you cards for you. Oh, thank you so much for your time. Okay.
Thank you, Carrianne and Arlene, for sharing your wisdom with us tonight. It was really wonderful to hear your thoughts on so many different topics, and I hope the audience appreciates that they've taken their time tonight to come speak to us. And thank you, Lisa, for being a wonderful moderator. Tonight is also, at the same time, we're also celebrating the book launch of Immersion, Asian science fiction and fantasy book. The executive editor for Ricepaper magazine, Alan Cho, first approached me in 2017 about creating a book with Asian science fiction and fantasy. And I remember telling him that it was a fantastic idea, but it's a lot of work, and I have a three-year-old at home. And for those familiar with small children, you know they're energy vampires, and nothing can get done when there are children around. But then Alan said the magical words, "But this book is a tribute to Jim Wong Chu." And Jim said that the future is science fiction and fantasy. And I somehow vaguely remember Jim saying something like this over chicken wings. So I thought, okay, fine. We'll do this project for Jim. And then William Tham, another editor from Ricepaper, jumped aboard. So this book has 3 editors, Alan, William, and me. And after 2 years of editing and working together, we found 15 authors. And we finally published Immersion, an Asian speculative fiction anthology. And we hope these stories will inspire people to dream beyond any limits. And we have 2 authors here tonight, Derwin and Serah. Serah's at the back, and if anyone wants a copy of Immersion, they're available somewhere on a table over there. And we also have Thea's book, Ocean of Minutes, as well. So the first author from Immersion to read is the wonderful Derwin Mak, and his story, Transubstantiation, had won the award for Best Science Fiction. For those not familiar, the Award Awards are Canada's Science Fiction Literature Awards. He also edited the anthology The Dragon and the Stars, as well as Where the Stars Rise, both award-winning books featuring Asian speculative fiction. And a lot of the anthologies he's edited have stories by overseas Chinese or Asian writers to present their viewpoints and experiences in science fiction and fantasy. So without further ado, Derwin, would you like to come and read an excerpt from Immersion?
Thanks, Jeannie. Right, and I'll read from The House of Hagfish, or an excerpt from The House of Hagfish, right, which is the story in Immersions. So, sharks invade Lake Ontario during swimsuit fashion shoot. Kathy Wong watched her phone in horror as the swimsuit models rushed back to the shore. An unsteady camera zoomed in on the shark fins circling in the water. A fashion reporter, pressed into duty as a science expert, breathlessly said, "Polar bears have disappeared from Churchill, Manitoba, but sharks have invaded Toronto's waterfront. Global warming has brought another new species here. Bow sharks can live in fresh water like lakes and rivers. They never used to swim up the St. Lawrence and into Lake Ontario, but now they've made their way here." Global warming also moved the Summer Fashion Festival to that warm October day. When Kathy was a teenager, she would have bundled up in a sweater and jeans and felt the chill air blow around her. A decade later, she wore a pink off-shoulder top and black miniskirt. She walked into the offices of Seago Textiles. Kathy walked beside the slime production vats. Her stomach churned from the odor. It smelled like stale sweat. Even after a month working here, she still hadn't gotten used to the stench. When I got a degree in fashion communication, I thought I would be designing ad campaigns for big brands like Givenchy, she said to Greg, the marine biologist. I never imagined I would sell eel snot to clothing manufacturers. Greg shook his head and took a deep breath. Like all scientists, he was used to the smell. They're not eels. Eels are in class Ichthyoperetgi. Hagfish are in class Myxini. Well, they look like eels, sort of. Slime eels. That's the nickname the fashion reporters gave to hagfish. It stinks here. Hurry, let's go to Alfie's room. They sped past the slime production vats and into a room with a sign reading Alfie. Kathy turned on the clean air intake. Posters of clothes hung on the walls. Another wall had a counter, sink, and refrigerator. Off to the side, a fish tank held a gray hagfish. It slithered at the bottom of the tank like its ancestors at the bottom of the ocean. The hagfish stopped evolving 300 million years ago. It has a skull but no spine. It has no jaw, but it has a mouth with rows of sharp teeth for tearing apart dead fish for food. Its primitive eyes are white spots that lack irises and pupils. They are merely retinas that can detect light but cannot create detailed images. It is seemingly ill-suited to thrive in an ocean full of large predators of vertebrae and good eyesight. It did, however, gain one evolutionary advantage. A hagfish is covered with glands that eject mucus. Combined with water, the mucus expands and creates a thick white slime that clogs the gills and mouths of predators. Any big fish that tries to bite a hagfish will suffocate on the goo. The mucus contains long threads of protein, 100 times thinner than human hair, but 10 times stronger than nylon. In 2012, biologists at the University of Guelph extracted the protein threads and spun them into fibers. Eventually, the textiles industry used hagfish slime to create alternatives to petroleum-based materials like polyester. Most slime production companies had a giant aquarium full of hagfish. Seagoat Textiles went 2 steps further. It genetically modified a hagfish that could create twice the amount of mucus. Then it used the hagfish's DNA to genetically modify a bacterium to create the mucus. The vats were full of bacteria, not hagfish. It was cheaper to keep bacteria than hagfish, giving seagoat a financial advantage. Not all companies had the talent to develop and patent a process of a creature like seagoats. "Good morning, Alfie," Kathy said to the hagfish in the tank. "The guys want to take him to the fashion show today," Greg said. "I'm getting the portable aquarium ready." "Whoa, you're taking Alfie to the fashion show?" "Why not? We owe our company's profits to his DNA. We made him. He's our pride and joy." Kathy looked at the posters. They showed models in cheap, ordinary blouses and pants. Each poster also had a portrait of Alfie with his white eyes and gaping mouth. He was anything but cute. Now that I'm in charge of production, I'm going to change our image," Kathy declared. "Our only customers are cheap clothing factories in China." "Nothing wrong with the Chinese market," Greg shrugged. "I'm wearing their clothes right now." Kathy looked at Greg's lime green t-shirt and faded red denim pants. She nodded slightly and noted how differently people dressed here compared to her previous employer of 2 months, the fashion magazine Tees. Everyone there wore stylish clothes. "China's a huge market, and it's great for us, but I want to expand our customer base," Kathy said. "I've invited Dior, Chanel, Versace, Armani, Givenchy, and Gucci to our show. I want the high-end designers to stop thinking of hagfish as ugly and disgusting." "But hagfish are ugly and disgusting." "All the more reason to keep Alfie away. Let's let the textiles sell themselves without our DNA donors slithering nearby." Greg shrugged. "Hey, Alfie, our marketing director thinks you're too ugly to slither down the runway. What do you think?" Alfie stared up at him with his white eye spots. "Oh, you're more interested in lunch," Greg said. He opened a refrigerator, took out a dead fish, and dropped it into the tank. Alfie's teeth tore a hole in the fish. He burrowed inside and began eating the fish from inside out. "We don't need to show that at the summer fashion festival," said Kathy. "Too late," Greg said. "His Mew Time video has already gone viral." Kathy sighed and tapped on her phone. A photo of a blonde woman appeared. "Giselle, the Victoria's Secret supermodel. How about hiring her for our campaign? I heard she came by our booth to look at Alfie last year." "Yeah, and she even held him, but it suddenly rained and Alfie panicked and slimed all over her." "Nobody told me about that," Kathy blurted. "Her dress was ruined. It was Alexander McQueen, I think. Oh, is my little Alfie feeling full now?" Alfie swam out of the fish's carcass. He had reduced it to a bag of skin. Greg reached into the tank to pet the hagfish. Alfie coiled himself at the tank's bottom and slowly sprang out of the water. Kathy screamed as the hagfish flew in front of her. "What the hell?" Greg shouted as he caught Alfie in his hands. "Hagfish can't jump." "I've never seen him do that before." Greg desperately grasped the slippery hagfish. When you guys modified his DNA, could you have given him superpowers?" Greg struggled as Alfie squirmed his hands. "Superpowers? This isn't a comic book." "Then how can he jump out of the water?" "Well, genetic manipulation sometimes creates unintended effects, like his ability to live in fresh water, which means he and his offspring can live in our lakes and rivers as well as the ocean," Kathy said. And I'll stop there.
Our second panel at LiterASIAN Toronto is a discussion on the modern writings of Asian Canadian science fiction and fantasy. And the authors featured on the second panel are Derwin Mak and Thea Lim, and the moderator is Tanya Aguila-Way. Tanya is an assistant professor of English at the University of Toronto. Her current book project, Asian Canadian Literary Ecologies, explores the intersection between scientific knowledge seeking and environmental anxiety in contemporary Asian Canadian literature. Can you all please join me in welcoming our guests and moderators?
Well, first of all, I want to start out for thanking the conveners of this wonderful event. It's really great to see it taking off into its second year. So thank you, Jeannie and Hannah and Lisa, for all of your work putting this together and putting together this excellent program. And as a fan of speculative fiction, science fiction, and fantasy, and all things genre fiction related, it is my great pleasure to welcome our two panelists for today, for the second session of the event, Thea Lim and Derwin Mak. And I'm going to introduce our two panelists first. Then Thea is going to read a small excerpt from An Ocean of Minutes, I think, from her new novel, An Ocean of Minutes. And then we will go into a Q&A and then open up the floor for more questions from the audience. Okay, so Thea Lim grew up in Singapore, but lives in Toronto with her family. She holds an MFA from the University of Houston and previously served as a nonfiction editor at Gulf Coast. Her writing has been published in an impressive array of publications, including Granta, the Paris Review, The Guardian, The Globe and Mail, Salon, the Southampton Review, and others. And she has received multiple awards and fellowships for her work. Thea's novella, The Same Woman, was published in 2007, and her first novel, An Ocean of Minutes, was published in 2018 to critical acclaim. Among other accolades, it was shortlisted for the Scotiabank Giller Prize, and it was also nominated for the CBC's Canada Reads competition. Derwin Mak is a science fiction writer, editor, and military historian. His short fiction has appeared in many magazines and anthologies, and he has also published short nonfiction articles on popular culture. And his writing has also received many accolades. His story, Transubstantiation, won the 2006 Aurora Award for Best Short Form Work in English. His novel, The Moon Under Her Feet, received the 2008 Aurora Award, and Where the Stars Rise, an anthology that he co-edited with Lucas Law, was a finalist for the 2018 Aurora Award. So please join me in welcoming our two panelists. And Thea is now going to read from her novel.
Hi there. Is this working? So I wanted to say thank you so much for having me here today. I have mixed race anxiety, so I'm always really thrilled when I get invited to things for writers of color and Asian writers. And also I'm just really so moved and grateful for the work that the LiterASIAN organizers are doing to safeguard and amplify our work and our voices. So I'm grateful for that. So in An Ocean of Minutes, it's 1981, and there's a pandemic, and Frank gets sick. And his girlfriend, Polly, will do anything to save him. And so she decides to take a job elsewhere in order to be able to afford the medical care that he needs. But the job is not just in another place, it's in another time. It's 12 years in the future. And once she goes forward, she can't come back. But Polly says to Frank, I have to go anyway, and I'm gonna find you on the other side. But when she gets to the other side, it's not 12 years, it's 17 years, and Frank is nowhere to be found. And the rest of the book tracks her search to find him. When I started writing An Ocean of Minutes, I was fixated on the idea that we are time-bound beings, and what that means is that we know on a cellular level that everything ends. And yet that never stops us from falling in love, making friends, adopting pets. And I wanted to make sense of how we can just do this so recklessly, without really sort of thinking about the consequences. I was surprised when this exploration turned into a time travel novel. And then I was even more surprised when I realized that my time travel novel was actually a book about immigration. But the more that I worked, the more that made sense. And it made sense first because I think anybody who has immigrated can tell you that it actually does kind of feel like time travel, because all places are not just a space, they are a time and a space. And the other reason why it made sense is because migration is something that has very much marked my own life, but it's also something that I didn't really feel licensed to write about. And maybe in a way, this was my unconscious's own strange way of sort of forcing that story out. At its heart, An Ocean of Minutes is a love story, but I would say so is any immigration tale. And so I'm going to read to you from the beginning, and it begins, as so much migration literature does, with a departure. September 1981. People wishing to time travel go to Houston Intercontinental Airport. At the orientation, the staff tell them that time travel is just like air travel. You even go to the same facility. People used to be apprehensive about airline travel too. But when you arrive at the airport, it is not the same at all. Before you can get within a mile of the terminals, you reach a bus stop moored at the edge of a vast concrete flat where you must leave your vehicle and ascend a snaking trolley like the ones they have at the zoo. A quarantine taxi makes its way to that lone bus stop, the airport appearing through a million chain-link diamonds. The driver is encased in an oval of hermetically sealed plexiglass. In the back seat, Frank is wearing a yellow hazmat suit. The color marks him as infected. Now is the time for last words, but Polly's got nothing. Frank keeps nodding off and then snapping awake, stiff-spined with terror until he can locate her beside him. We can still go back. He has been saying this for days. Even in his sleep, he carries on this argument, and when he opens his eyes, he moves seamlessly from a dream fight to a waking one. Already his voice is far off, sealed away inside his suit. Polly pulls his forehead to her cheek, but his mask stops her short. They can only get within 3 inches of each other. The suit rubs against the vinyl car seat and makes a funny, crude noise, but they don't laugh. Polly would like to breathe in the smell of Frank's skin one last time, a smell like salt cut with something sweet, like when it rains in the city. But all she gets is the dry smell of plastic. Now they are pulling up to the lone bus stop, and they can see the new time travel facility across the lot bisected by trolleys. The facility is a monolith, the widest, tallest building either of them has ever seen, and something in Polly quails. The only thing remaining of familiar airport protocol is the logistical thoughtlessness of the curb. Once you reach it, the line of unfeeling motorists waiting behind you means you only have seconds to say goodbye. So thank you.
Thank you for that beautiful reading. And I guess I wanted to start out by asking you, just to sort of echo what happened in the first panel, by asking you to talk a little bit about your family history, your roots in Canada and elsewhere, and how that has shaped your perspective as a writer.
Yeah, family history? Okay, so, yeah, my father's from Hong Kong, my mother's from Malaysia. They're both Chinese. They actually met here in Canada, in Sackville, New Brunswick, which is kind of weird because people say there's no Chinese people in Sackville, New Brunswick, but there are. Sackville, New Brunswick has a university called Mount Allison, and back in the 50s, Mount Allison got a lot of its students from British colonies, right? Mm-hmm. So that's where they met, and and we lived in a variety of places, Peterborough, but the longest time in Kitchener, Ontario, 100 kilometers west of here, and then I moved out here to find work in the 1980s. Now, how has this shaped my writing? It's interesting. I guess I'm not. Well, I guess part of the growing up process was being babysat by television, like a lot of our like a lot of my generation was, probably a lot of the post-World War II generation probably was. And I watched a lot of science fiction, so that probably influenced my decision to write science fiction. I just loved the genre, especially when you're at that age, you're a teenager, and Star Wars comes out, and that changes the way people perceive science fiction. But it was also a time when 1970s was a time when there was a lot of science fiction being published. And in terms of how it that influenced my decision to get into science fiction writing, how my environment influenced what I wrote. Growing up in Kitchener-Waterloo, I mean, it's a nice town, but it's not very multicultural. There's not at least when I lived there were not many Asian or of any sort, or not very many black people either. Not very culturally diverse. So I started adding such people into the characters of my fiction, simply because I noticed that lack of diversity outside of stereotypical depictions in science fiction as well. Science fiction, I found, could have lots of diverse characters, but a lot of them tend to run towards certain stereotypes.
Is this working? Oh, it is.
Oh,
Okay.
it is. Yeah.
The old one too. So my father is, he's Chinese and he's from Singapore. And my mother is white and she's from England. And of course they met in Australia, because that's where people from England and Singapore go to meet. And then my dad really wanted to live in the West. And my mother's story is that he asked everybody, and Canada was the one place that said yes. And he actually was trying to, I can tell you this because the statute of limitations has passed. He actually, while he was living in Australia, he was supposed to go back to Singapore for national service for conscription, and he didn't. And so he wound up actually having to take a boat from Australia to Canada, and that was how he got here, so that he wouldn't have to go through Singapore and go into the army. So I was born in Canada, and I grew up in Toronto, not far from here. But when I was 8 years old, there was a recession in the late 80s, and through a number of decisions, my parents decided to move us to Singapore. So sometimes I say that my family reverse migrated. And then when I was 15, we moved back to Canada. And then when I was 16, we moved back to Singapore. And then when I was 18, I moved to England for a year. And then I moved back to Canada. And it's sort of, my life has been a lot of coming and going. How this has shaped me, I guess, like I said, migration has been a huge part of my life, but I don't belong to any kind of recognizable wave of migration. Even as a Chinese person, I so much appreciate so much of Chinese Canadian and Asian Canadian writing, but a lot of those stories are sort of located in very specific communities, and communities that I don't always feel not sure that I sort of belong to, or that I can take ownership of. What happened to me when I was growing up in Singapore is that I was always seen as white because I'm mixed, and really you sort of are, race changes depending on where you are. So I was seen as white, and when I moved to Canada, I think I was living here 3 or 4 years when I suddenly, with quite a bit of shock, realized that when people were talking about that Asian girl, they were talking about me. So I think partly what that meant was that wherever I was, everybody was always somewhere else. And so that meant that I did a lot of corresponding, I did a lot of writing, and so that sort of turned me into a writer. But I think the other thing that turned me into a writer was feeling a little bit like I had had all these experiences that seemed outside of language, because all of the narratives that I saw around me didn't really express my experience. And I think genre fiction historically has been sort of seen as sort of below literary fiction, and yet I have found it so useful and so meaningful for being able to tell those kind of stories that feel outside of language.
Yeah, and my next question is kind of a follow-up to that. I'm interested in the differences between the way you each tell your stories of coming to science fiction or speculative fiction. Derwin, you mentioned growing up on the genre of science fiction and sort of coming into that space through what you were watching on TV. And for you, Thea, you mentioned earlier, as you when introducing your reading that the fact that that a notion of minutes turned into a story about time traveling was sort of a surprise to you. So it seems like less of a, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but less of a conscious decision to write within that specific genre. So I'm wondering, you know, taking those differences into account, what the two of you, or what is it that made you turn towards the speculative or the field of science fiction? What is it about genre fiction that you think enables you to tell your stories in a way that maybe other genres don't? What kinds of narrative possibilities do these genres open up for you?
It's working, right? Yeah. Well, I think what I grew up, where I hit my teenage years, at a time when science fiction as a genre was starting to become more visible to the public as a respectable form of literature and art. And I'll elaborate on that, because if you look at the history of the genre, it had this pulpy comic book image for a while. But around the 1960s, science fiction literature began to get more literary, began to get more into not just action adventure, but themes about the ecology and women's rights and women's issues and racial injustice and social issues. So that's the time you got novelists like, say, Logan's Run and Stand on Zanzibar, and Ursula K. Le Guin began writing, you know, The Left Hand of Justice. So that began in the 60s, and it carried on to the 70s. And movies that use science fiction movies, we got a sort of mini science fiction boom in the 60s. And science fiction movies in the 60s weren't action adventure kiddie movies. You got 2001: A Space Odyssey, or social satire like Planet of the Apes, right? Or Logan's Run in the early to mid 70s, right? And this was also the time when science fiction publishing was at its height. Younger generations, those who grew up playing video games, look at me in disbelief when I say that there was a time when people read books and magazines a lot more than they do now for recreation, but they did. And when I was in my teen years, at least 5 of the major science fiction magazines were still being published. There were numerous publishers publishing anthologies of short stories every year. It was a great time to actually develop the habit for reading science fiction. Then in 1977, Star Wars came out, and it was funny. Star Wars created a boom in science fiction movies. At the same time, it also, and as much as I like Star Wars, it also turned the genre back towards action-adventure, kiddie, comic book stuff, right? So suddenly you didn't see movies like Soylent Green or Planet of the Apes anymore, or Logan's Run, right? You got, you know, stuff like The Last Starfighter, for example. But it did create more interest in the genre, and I think my being a fan of that genre at the time, the imagination appeared to be, it was a time when science fiction was very imaginative and also looking into social issues as well. And I think I wanted to be a writer, I just felt creative. I think it was just natural fit that I would go into that genre. I was also one of those writers that came up through fandom. I went to science fiction conventions, I went to comic conventions, I wore Star Trek costumes at Star Trek conventions. I have a Doctor Who scarf and so on. So I came up through the fan route.
Thank you. Thea?
Yeah, so as I said, it was a bit of a surprise to me when I started writing science fiction, or speculative fiction, really. And that's really just because my training was mostly in realism. I do have a degree in English literature from the University of Toronto, and I think I had sort of been trained to think that if you want to write literature, it's hard enough. If you're not, you don't belong to a certain group of people that we associate with writers, which usually at the time, especially in the early 2000s, would have been more kind of white men. you definitely can't go out there and write science fiction. I had always loved a lot of speculative fiction and science fiction, all the things that Derwin was talking about, and sort of really atmospheric, otherworldly kind of environments. Like one of my favorite cartoons, which was actually very formative to the way that I tell stories when I was growing up, was the Batman the Animated Series. Was something that I really loved. But I didn't think that it was okay to write that stuff. So when my novel started to turn towards speculative fiction, I felt really very happy, because it was sort of this accident that had happened, and in the end something that made a lot of sense. And also at the time, so I started writing it in 2011, and it was starting to become more and more common in literary fiction for literary writers to write kind of hybrid novels, so like The Road by Cormac McCarthy or Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. So it was becoming something that you're seeing more of. Now you kind of can't swing a cat in a bookstore without hitting some kind of literary genre hybrid. But I think what I was really interested in was I wanted to write true science fiction. I wanted to think about what would it really be like to time travel, because when we think about time travel, of course, we have H.G. Wells, and then we have sort of more modern stories of time travel, but they always are sort of fantastical, and they're always outside of the establishment. But I sort of think, like, if we had time travel, it would be just like everything else, right? It would be highly kind of regulated. It would only be accessible to people who could afford to do it. There would probably be different classes of travel. And the more that I started to think about how do bodies move in our world, I started to wind up thinking about sort of migrant workers and bonded labor. And so that's where that came up. And in a way, what that's doing is perhaps completely taking the fun out of everything, I think. But I did find it to be a super useful way to think about our own world, and to maybe put our own world in new or different housing so that we can see it again. Because what often happens is we just kind of inured or immune to the same old stories of kind of migration and migrant labor and the ways that people suffer when they're trying to move across the globe.
Yeah, thank you. And I wonder, you mentioned that it's kind of hard to go to a bookstore now and not find some version of speculative fiction or some hybrid of genre fiction, and I would agree with that observation. And I'm wondering if you think, for both of you, if you think there's something about the particular cultural or like historical moment that we're living in that demands kind of a turn towards the speculative. I'm thinking back to what Carrianne said in the previous panel about the fact that we're living through a moment of crisis. We're in a planet in crisis, and it sounded from, she's not here to confirm that, but from the way she described her own latest work, that it's also taking a kind of speculative turn. And I'm thinking, you mentioned Kazuo Ishiguro. I'm thinking also of somebody like Ruth Ozeki. There seems to be a lot of writers who have normally written in a realist vein who are all of a sudden turning towards the speculative. So I wonder if there's something about this particular cultural moment that has triggered that in some way.
I think on the one hand, what's happening is that it's a loosing of boundaries in general. And I think what's worth remembering, and often is hard to remember when it seems like we live in very bleak political times, but is that in a lot of ways the moment we're living in is actually a backlash to a moment of sort of greater progressiveness. And that's where I think that loosing of boundaries comes from, right? There was a period, I think, probably around 2012, like in the early, what are we in the teens? In the early teens, where there was sort of much more movement and diversity and a lot more, I think, comfort with seeing things coming and going. And so I think that's where a lot of that comfort comes with. And then, of course, there is that idea, I think, more and more, that it does feel like we're living in a dystopic reality. I always sort of say that, like, if you've seen or read The Hunger Games, it's like we live in the capital, which is not something we like to think. We like to think we live in the districts, but I think we live in the capital. And so trying to use our literature to grapple with that. What I feel sort of sorry for, especially for kind of like a tried and true kind of fan and writer like Derwin, is that I do feel in a lot of ways that literary writers come in and they don't actually really respect science fiction. It's like a cheap kind of cool way to add a little flair to their literary novels, and And so I feel like if I had been kind of like historically a science fiction writer, I might be kind of really tired and annoyed by it. Thinking we've been doing cool stuff forever, and like you've suddenly discovered it and you think it's so great, but it's always been cool and innovative and interesting and very political, right? So there's something to think about.
Well, I think science fiction's been always political for a long time. Even going back to H.G. Wells, it's some people read that as a comment on British imperialism at the time. And as I mentioned, in the 60s, science fiction was becoming very political with all the social movements and changes going on. I think what you see now in the bookstores, you mentioned, Thea, you mentioned Hunger Games, which is very dystopian, and I thought, oh my God, children's literature has really changed. I remember the Hardy Boys were investigating, the missing lunchbox, and here, they're being killed in gladiator combat, right? But I've also noticing that the type of speculative fiction that's popular is changing. Science fiction used to be the more predominant form when you went to the bookstores. Now it's increasingly fantasy, right? Which I find very interesting. Well, interesting and also disturbing. Now I'll explain that. Because when I put out an anthology call, the submissions skew 9-to-1 fantasy to science fiction, so it's very hard to get a balanced anthology, right? And I various people I've talked to have speculated, why is it that a lot of our writers seem to be writing fantasy more than science fiction? Is it because they're not interested in science anymore? They can't keep up with the science, right? I mean, there's one country where it's the other way around. That's China, but that has to do with the Communist Party influencing what they want people to write. As one Chinese writer told me, China needs more science, technology, industry, and business. We don't need more superstitions, right? So it's a Communist Party ideology at work there. But without such government controls, why is the West, well, primarily the United States, Canada, and Britain, shifting towards fantasy? And I really don't know the answer to this. I'm maybe wondering whether it has something to do with the lack of science education in some places in the United States, or whether it could be due to people are so used to different technological changes every year that to them science is boring now. I don't know the answer. Right.
I mean, in some ways, that might just be a very crass thing. It's the Lord of the Rings effect. If you look at sort of where the money is in the market, that's sort of where it's coming up. To which I sort of think that Carrianne had very good advice, which is don't write to the market. But yeah.
I wonder if, in thinking about, expanding upon this question of what science fiction and speculative fiction offers to narratives about Asian Canadian or Asian North American experiences, I wonder if there's something to be said for the way in which genre fiction is able to elude the kinds of anthropological or sociological readings that are often projected onto writing by racialized authors. We talked about a lot about in the previous panel about the kinds of expectations that people bring to writing by racialized authors and by Asian Canadian authors, and that there's this tendency to read the fiction as if it were a kind of or as if the writer were a native informant on their community. So I wonder if when you're writing in speculative fiction or science fiction, it's a bit easier to resist that kind of reading.
I'll take it, yeah. Yeah, now, if I think what you're asking is, I think our previous panelists said that, a racialized author almost always is the readership expects them or perceives them as saying something profound about their ethnic group or culture or society, right? And do we have this issue in science fiction, or does this happen in science fiction? I'd say it happens to a lesser extent, right? I think because science fiction readers are used to having it happens in a couple ways, and it gets complicated. Science fiction readers are used to reading about, imaginary or fictional societies or planets, and so on, right? What I find interesting is that when you write about a real one, they panic. They say, "Oh no, I don't understand this at all." It's funny, they can understand, a completely made-up society on a planet of amoeba-like beings. But when you write about Chinatown in the 50s in San Francisco or Toronto, they suddenly panic and say, "Oh God, I can't relate to this." Right? It's funny, science fiction readers, some of them just can't relate to other human beings if they're not of the same country. They find it easier to relate to a completely fictional society. However, there's a growing trend amongst science fiction readers to actually want to read about the more diverse experiences of their authors. And you can see that in the growing numbers of people who are reading, I'm getting her initials reversed, J.M. N.K. Jemisin, okay, she won a Hugo Award last year, right? And there's a growing number of writers who want to read from her perspective, and I think what happens though is that when a racialized or a writer from an ethnic minority writes something, science fiction readers are of two minds often. Of three minds. Most of them go in thinking, "Oh, this is going to be interesting. Let's see how much of this is really," and they think, how much of this is really the culture or ethnic group as it really is, and how much of it is the science fiction fantasy elements added to it. Like obviously those origami creatures and Ken Liu's The Paper Menagerie really can't talk to humans, right? That's the fantasy element. And then so a lot of them approach it from that point of view. They want to see you say something about an ethnic group or a culture or society, but at the same time they realize that you're going to infuse it with fantasy and science fiction elements. And then there's another group that is starting to get a little bit, well, not a little bit, a lot political at science fiction conventions and so on, that say we're tired of the multiculturalism. Let's go back to having heroic white males and spaceships as being the norm for science fiction. And there's a weird backlash from that group too going on these days. I don't understand why, but it's happening.
I think it's possible that the predominance of things like alien abduction stories or apocalyptic stories within any era of Western literature is actually just kind of repression of us, like us repressing our own kind of origin story. And what I mean by our origin story is that as countries, we were very much built up by the genocide of the indigenous people and the Atlantic slave trade. And so it makes sense that we would suddenly want to tell stories about alien abductions, or that we would suddenly want to tell stories about the end of the world, because that is what our lands are based on. And it makes sense, and it's quite tragic if you think about it, that it's only kind of now that people of color are getting to tell those stories themselves. So one of the top selling books of last year was Moon of the Crusted Snow by Wabgashig Rice, which is an apocalyptic story about an indigenous community. And you can see just sort of the interest in alien abduction in a lot of African American writers comes from the fact that they say that, the slave trade was the original alien abduction story. So I think that's where that comes from. For myself, I think it wasn't so much that I didn't want, that I was trying to avoid being read as an Asian writer, was why I wrote speculative fiction, because like I said, I'm not always read as Asian. And in a way, when my novel came out last year in Singapore, there were a bunch of news stories saying that, I was a Singaporean writer. And I really was shocked by that, because I'd never been called Singaporean in any time that I lived there. And I was very moved, and I was happy that I had finally sort of earned the mantle. But really what I was trying to do was that I felt that for, I think, any writer of color writing in the West, you're so aware of who's come before you. And there are so many amazing migration stories. And I kind of felt like I can't just write another migration story, right? Like I have to figure out an interesting way to do it. So it was really sort of like, you can't just tell the same story again and again, the need to innovate, that sort of led me to write it in that way. But the other thing is that I really wanted to do was I wanted to write in more than one register. And what I mean by that is that I didn't want to write a story that people would sort of, I guess, be able to pigeonhole, that people would say, oh, that's just for this kind of reader. And you see, in so many ways that writers of color who write about their community experiences are pigeonholed, not just they're pigeonholed in the way that bookstores are shelved, they're pigeonholed in the ways that the books are marketed. And so I was trying to get out of that, and I was trying to figure out how can I tell a story that is about multiple things at once. And so some readers can read it this way and other readers can read it that way. And I have to say that maybe in some ways I was successful in a way that I didn't anticipate, in that some of my readers, for example, my acquiring editors who bought my book, didn't realize that it was a book about immigration. So that's kind of a double-edged sword for me, because in a way I feel, as much as I'm grateful for the attention that the book gets, and I'm so happy that anyone ever reads it, it's mildly painful for me when I see that in the main, it's not seen as a book about immigration, because that's the way I see it.
Thea, just to pick up on the comment that you just made about the importance of being aware of who has come before you. We've been, and to sort of pair it with something you said earlier about speculative fiction and science fiction not generally being viewed as proper literature or as high literature. I can very much see how that's the case in kind of like the mainstream literary market. But I'm thinking now that if we think about the Asian Canadian literary canon, and especially women writers within the Asian Canadian literary canon, there is this strong thread of speculative fiction with people like Hiromi Goto and Larissa Lai, that who are so prolific and who have been such key figures, even in canonical, and who are recognized as canonical Asian Canadian writers. So I wondered if they have influenced your work in any way, if you see your work as building on that heritage in any way.
I wish I could say yes. I mean, I'm extremely grateful for their presence. And I think I just never thought about it that way, because my own journey to realizing myself as a diasporic person has been very weird. Like I really, again, when I was an undergraduate at U of T, I learned the term diaspora, and it wasn't until 5 years later that I was like, oh, that's me. So I would have encountered their works, and I did actually read Hiromi Goto when I was here. And I loved the book, but I didn't think it was about me. And it's only sort of latterly, like a kind of like delayed grief almost, that I'm like, oh, this is a book that I can take in and that I can sort of belong to. So, yeah.
Thank you. I now want to turn the conversation towards the topic of publishing, right? Your experiences with publishing as an industry. You both have experience as editors and working within that end of writing, and we are living through a cultural moment where there has been a lot of discussion, especially on social media, around the systemic inequalities that shape the Canadian literary market and Canadian publishing, and how this influences what kinds of stories get to be told and what kinds of stories get to be heard. So I'm wondering if, for both of you, what has been your experience around that? Have you faced those constraints yourself, either as a writer or as an editor? And if so, can you talk about the experiences that you've had around that?
Okay, so I think what you're referring to is that, and I saw another science fiction writer mention this, and this is his opinion, that Canadian science fiction publishing houses were typically run by older white males who were really conservative but pretended to be liberals, right? Because that looked good at sci-fi conventions. Are you referring to that type of air that in the publishing industry, or?
I guess there's, I mean, yeah, I wasn't thinking specifically along those lines, but yeah, specifically within the science fiction world, there does seem to be that backlash that was referenced earlier. But then also within the CanLit sphere, there's a lot of conversation on social media around, people have been referring to Canadian literature as dumpster fire. Yes, I was trying to think of the metaphor, which is everywhere now, and I should have remembered it. But CanLit as a dumpster fire that kind of just tokenizes and marginalizes racialized and other minoritized writers. So I guess there's two ends of the conversation that you can both speak to.
Yeah, this is a pretty broad topic, and it gets kind of complicated when you introduce a science fiction genre into it too. Now, within science fiction itself, there is over the last 5 years, there's something that American science fiction caused the puppy backlash, and there was a movement by two separate groups who nicknamed themselves the Sad Puppies and the Rabid Puppies against multiculturalism, and they kept on saying we need more diversity of thought, which is, more published works by straight white male conservative writers, right? And they kept on saying we're being shut out of the awards, and I was thinking, well, wait a minute, each of you guys has a publishing contract and an agent. I don't. What are you guys complaining about, right? But they felt that, white males were the new minority, et cetera, and I thought, you're getting bigger royalty checks than I am. Don't complain, right? But at the same time, as I mentioned, there are more minority writers from different backgrounds getting their works published, and I think what's happening in the United States and Canada is that we're getting as the older, more established science fiction publishing houses, they probably they do have a reputation of going back to the same type of author for the same type of work over and over again. Like Tor Books is pretty predictable. Dog has some diversity, but Daw's pretty good. But it goes back. It's in an economic crunch. It will go back to its own best-selling authors over and over again. But what you do see is a growing trend to have more small presses coming out in the United States and Canada, and they're publishing works that the bigger publishers either don't have the time or don't want to take the risk in publishing, right? And I mean, Space and Time magazine was just resurrected a year ago. It was going through a period when it wasn't selling well, and then a year ago, December 2018, its publisher sold it to another publisher, Angela Yuriko Smith, and she's publishing stuff that other publishers didn't want to take on because it was either too experimental or too diverse compared to other things. Now, ignore the meltdown of cheesy publications that's going on right now. That's a science fiction horror publisher. I'm not sure if you heard, but it's melting down right now because of accusations of harassment, bullying, gaslighting, and racism, right? So ignore that particular small press. It's finished. But there are other small presses. I mean, this Immersion is published by a small press, Dark Helix, in partnership with the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop. So I think where you'll see more diverse, more interesting science fiction coming out is from the small presses. And at the Hugo Awards last year, I was just amazed. Not a single one of the nominated stories came from the big science fiction magazines, the traditional big science fiction magazines like Analog or Fantasy and Science Fiction. They all came from smaller literary magazines or online magazines. It's really interesting who publishes what in the genre now. So I think there is hope for science fiction to get out of the dumpster fire, if you will.
Yeah, thank you. Thea?
So I think this is a good audience to tell a story to that I don't always get the response I want. So in 2009, I wrote an article about Manny Pacquiao, the Filipino boxer, and how all of the Asian men that I knew really loved him. And this was before Manny Pacquiao became so associated with homophobia and misogyny. But I was really fascinated by how it seemed almost as if he was like this sort of real life avatar for a lot of Asian men I knew who felt really emasculated and really invisible. And they had just this like immense love for him that I thought was really touching. And so I wrote an article about it, and I called it Manny Pacquiao and the Color of Fandom. And it was published in Salon, which at the time was a pretty big internet publication. And it went to press, and it came out, and I was very excited. And they called it, finally, an Asian who can pack a punch. And so, as you can imagine, there's a few problems with this. It's a racist title, but also every single comment, I don't think anyone read the article. Every single comment was, have you never heard of Bruce Lee? What is wrong with you? So I wrote to my editor, who was a white guy, and I said, can you please change the title? Like, this is a really awful title. And I tried to think, obviously they didn't like my original title, but I tried to think of other ones that could have worked. And he just didn't write back to my emails. And then, I don't know, probably 4 days later, he wrote back and he was like, oh, I think it was fine, like, don't worry about it. And to this day, and it was one of my first really big credits, and to this day, if you Google that article, it still has that title. So I actually, on my CV, I have it under my original title, which means no one can find it, but I'm not gonna put that on my CV. The reason why I tell that story, though, is because that was in 2009, which is not that long ago. It is kind of long ago. But that was sort of the attitude that people had, I think editors had. And now I think we're in a really different moment. Of course, there is the canlit dumpster fire. But I think maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but that's partly because a lot of writers of color and their concerns are having a voice now in a way that they didn't have before. And I think there is either a genuine desire on the part of the white establishment to include writers of color, or they're just terrified and they're going to do it because they're scared, which is fine. I'll take that. So I think it's easy to feel discouraged, but just like I think all the examples that Derwin gave, I think we are in a different moment where for right reasons or wrong reasons, I think the establishment is opening up a little bit more.
Well, thank you both for your super thoughtful responses to the questions. And now I think it's time to open that up for the audience. And there's hopefully a microphone around. Okay. Yeah. Well,
a major walk. Growing up in the 70s and 80s, when you look at, let's say, movies or television shows in North America, you don't see a lot of, let's say, Asian science or Asian influenced science fiction. The only closest thing you got to it was watching Godzilla movies. And the thing was, you wonder, like with the Bruce Lee movies or the B kung fu flicks, where they always focused on either the past, which is either 2,000 years ago, or let's say the like the current state and like police corruption in Hong Kong back then. But the thing is, fast forward to now, where you see, let's say, Asian voices in science fiction starting to come out. I just wondered, will Asian science fiction or Asian speculative stories will be, let's say, read in traditional markets, like in, let's say, China or Australia or UK, will the Asian market read that as opposed to the mainstream? Because back then, when I was growing up, there wasn't any outlet for that. We were only seeing it through the lens of, let's say, white, let's say, movies or media or whatever. This is the time where like we could turn the lens around and see ourselves in there.
Do you mean science fiction written by like diasporic Chinese, or do you mean like science fiction written just by Chinese writers?
It's both.
Yeah, because I think like some of the most exciting science fiction that's being written right now is coming out of China. And like I think, do you know the name of that movie that came out this year? It was like the biggest grossing. Yeah, The Moving Earth was like the yeah. So The Moving Earth, and that was the biggest movie in China ever.
But it's interesting because I've met Chinese science fiction writers and fans, and you know how we talk about Chinese science fiction, Asian science fiction. You know how South Afrikaners really aren't the same as Dutch anymore, and Americans aren't really the same as English and Scots anymore, that they all have a common origin, but they all evolve differently. I've seen the same thing happen in science fiction. Chinese Americans and Chinese Canadians aren't really the same as mainland Chinese. And it shows in the science fiction, and it shows in their taste in science fiction. I'm noticing that. I think it's interesting. Mainland Chinese, they like stories about hard science fiction with technology and engineering and all that, space flight and all that stuff, partly because their government encourages them to think in technology and industry and so on. How should I put this? Chinese American science fiction writers who write on, things like LGBTQ themes or social justice themes were actually censored over in the mother country, so to speak. And I won't name a name, but one of them didn't get a visa to travel over there to visit his family, right? And so, meanwhile, the science fiction from China is popular here due to translation, especially the three-body problem. But I think this is a complicated question because I think North Americans are starting to like science fiction both by mainland Chinese and by Chinese Americans. I'm not sure if mainland Chinese are going to start liking science fiction written by Chinese Americans or Chinese Canadians.
So who are some like big Asian American or Asian Canadian science fiction writers?
Well, there's Ken Liu, and he was the one who translates Louis Suzin's novels. There's also a new up-and-coming one, E. Lily Yu, who won, it's not called the Campbell Award anymore. I forget what the new name is, but she won that back in 2012 or 2013. I'm trying to remember. And there's a lot more of them now coming out. When Eric Choi and I edited The Dragon and Stars 10 years ago, we really had to beat the bushes to find Chinese American or overseas Chinese writers. Now there's so many of them showing up at science fiction conventions and getting published in all the different magazines. And it's not just Chinese Americans. I'm seeing a great growth in number of South Asian Canadian and American authors as well as Southeast Asian Canadian and Americans as well. The last 10 years has been remarkable in the industry, in the publishing industry for science fiction.
Yeah, and just a little bit more sort of in my area, you do see a lot of the writers of really kind of hot, like literary, sort of dystopic, apocalyptic fiction are actually Asian women. So Ling Ma, who wrote Severance, that came out last year. And just this year, The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa has been like one of the hottest books of the year. And she's been writing in Japanese for many years, but has sort of recently been discovered. So I don't know if that answers your question. It does seem good, right? It seems like things are on the up, I think.
Hi, it's been so great hearing from you both. I was just wondering, when it comes to writing like speculative or science fiction, like what kind of research do you do? And like how long do you spend doing research before beginning a story or a book in your case?
Yeah, the research depends on what the story is about, of course, right? So one of my first stories was about aliens who land during a snowstorm and get mistaken for sleet because they're so small that people think they're part of the snow, right? So I did research on, weather, snow, how does it happen? What are different types of snow? Now, in terms of, so there's a lot of reading to do. If it's going to be about another culture or society, you talk to people, you watch them on YouTube, because oddly enough, YouTube, you learn a lot more from people making videos of themselves than from National Geographic people making videos of them, right? I mean, they're both good, but with YouTube and home movies, you see, hey, I never knew this would happen, right? So the research could be very diverse. How much time? Okay, you know what? Don't spend more time doing your research than you spent writing the story. I once heard a horrendous story about someone who was writing a short story about Pearl Harbor and spent 3 months researching all the different ships, and the ship only shows up for like one paragraph, right? The rest of it is about the people running around and so on. So that's a good rule of thumb. Don't spend more time researching than you actually do writing the story. So.
You've just basically described what I do, which is.
The temptation is horrible, isn't it?
But I also think like maybe that's doesn't sound like an efficient thing to do, but maybe there's some sort of like mental function that's doing for you. Like maybe you need to do that in order to feel you have license to write the story, which has its own kind of purpose. So I am not the kind of hard science writer that the Communist Party in China would like. I think I did a lot of research when I was looking at just the science parts of my novel. What I did, like a typical English major, was I looked at other time travel narratives and sort of tried to get ideas for the mechanism from them. What I wound up doing the most research on actually was on migrant labor, because I don't have any lived experience as a migrant laborer, even though growing up in Singapore, it's a country where there's a lot of very visible migrant labor. So that was where I did a lot of the work. And then just sort of a lot of geographical research. The novel is set in Galveston and in Buffalo, and so I visited those cities quite a bit. But I'm very much kind of, what do they say, that as writers there's planners and then there's pantsers? The pantser, you fly by the seat of your pants. So I'm like a sort of a pantser, at least when it comes to research. I would sort of figure out what do I need to know, and then I would fill in the gaps. I wouldn't sort of sit down and try to figure out everything else first.
Cool. Yeah, I'm also an English major, so I feel that. Just a quick follow-up. What's your favorite time travel narrative?
The one I say right now is Terminator 1, which I feel is like an underrated movie. No one talks about everyone talks about 2, but I think the love story at the center of the first Terminator movie is one of the most beautiful love stories in American cinema. But do you have a favorite time travel?
Yeah, it's actually a relatively new one. There's in New York playing right now. There's 2 back-to-back Harry Potter plays, right? And it's in the future. It's about the sons and daughters of the Harry Potter character we know. And in that one, they time travel to fix a problem. But every time they time travel to fix a problem, they create another problem. So they have to go back in time to fix that problem. And they create 3 more problems. They time travel back. The 3 problems they try to fix they fix them and create 12 more problems. So you get the idea.
Awesome, thanks.
That's Harry Potter and time travel?
Yeah,
Wow.
it's weird. They combine Harry Potter with science fiction.
Any more questions? Are we ready to? Yes, we're at time. So thank you again to both of you, Thea Lim and Derwin Mak, for a wonderful discussion and for the generosity of your answers. And we're moving on to the next phase of the readings, and there's thank you cards for both of you.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, so our final event on our schedule is the second reader from Immersion, Serah Lewis. She's a Canadian writer of Indian descent. She's currently studying biology and professional writing and communications at the University of Toronto, Mississauga campus. She's also currently an associate editor for University of Toronto Mississauga's literary journal With Caffeine and Careful Thought and their research journal Compass. I'd also like to give a shout out to Serah's family. Her entire family's here, so yay! I've never had my family show up for anything. Anyhow, so I'd like to welcome Serah Lewis to read from her short story in Immersion.
Hi, I'm Serah, and I'm going to be reading an excerpt from my short story, Unveiling the Night. Have you learned nothing from all the stories I read to you when you were a child? The origin stories, how we came to be? Her family members were all practicing Hindus, but she had foregone the weekly visits to the temple a few years ago. She didn't believe in the all-powerful gods and goddesses, the demons that combated them in ancient wars, the tales of boons and sacrifice. These aren't real Achama. They're more like extended metaphors. Don't give me the nonsense they fed you in school, child. Now for a minute, please just hear me out. What do you remember from the stories I told you about the gods and goddesses? Arya decided to humor her for the time being, reciting from memory. There's a Trimurti, the trinity of Shiva, Brahma, and Vishnu, and the Trivedi of Saraswati, Lakshmi, and Parvati. Her grandmother reached for two of the small figures from the bookcase. She held up the statue of a bare-chested woman, her hips jutting to the side, with her thumb and middle finger joined at their tips. And what do you know of Parvati? She's supposed to be Shiva's wife and equal. How is this important right now? Who is this? The other figure she held was markedly different. A 10-armed woman clasped a long sword, a sickle, and an assortment of other objects, including a human head. Her tongue stretched out in a grimace, and her head spread outwards in an untamed mass. She was clad in a necklace of skulls and a skirt of skeletal arms. A man lay sprawled under her foot, Shiva. Kali, one of Parvati's forms. She's seen as a protector, a warrior, and a destroyer of evil forces, also associated with sexuality. So you haven't forgotten everything I've taught you. That doesn't mean I believe any of it, Arya retorted. Don't be foolish, child. Use that brain of yours and think. What is life after death? Our bodies may wither and rot away, but our souls remain preserved until we are born again. Reincarnation. Precisely. Until we have completely freed ourselves from vice and sin, our souls continue to pass on to new bodies. And you think I'm a reincarnation of the goddess Kali? Yes. Arya stared at her grandmother for a moment, suspended in incredulity, as she sought the words to politely but firmly reject the notion. Achama, listen, I don't mean to make light of religion, but your beliefs are your own, Arya pleaded. I don't share them. She didn't want to offend the older woman, but the idea was ludicrous. Her grandmother cast her gaze upwards, muttering something under her breath that sounded suspiciously like a prayer for forbearance before turning back to face Arya. Did you know Hinduism is considered the oldest religion in the world by many scholars and historians? Our roots stretch back for centuries, and yet you still doubt? Your friend Ronnie, she said you consumed the creature, didn't she? If you recall, there is a tale of Kali defeating the demon Raktabija and his army. He was undefeatable because every drop of blood of his that was spilt would produce a clone of himself. And how did Kali defeat him? She drank his blood. Arya could see a flimsy vein between this line of thought and Ronnie's hallucination. So you're saying I'm some sort of cannibal. Not a cannibal, oh no. You ate a demon deer. That's an entirely different matter. Thank you.
And before our event ends, I would like to thank you, the audience, for attending. The most important VIP of all literary festivals is you. If there is no audience, there wouldn't be an event to celebrate our wonderful authors. And if you're interested in supporting LiterASIAN Toronto, we're always looking for volunteers. And as well, we have copies of Immersions, and our authors are here to sign it. So please have a good night and stay warm in Toronto. Thank you.